2007 was a bad year in Afghanistan. Thousands of people were killed, including 30 Canadian soldiers. Hundreds of Afghan police died, 16 just last Saturday during an attack in Helmand province. Large parts of the country remain largely outside of government control. NATO forces have been battling increasingly aggressive Taliban guerrillas with some success. But as you'll see in my special report, the mission is overstretched, unable even to guard key roads, to the point some ask if it's mission impossible. NATO's problems in Afghanistan begin with a basic fact. This is a very long way from its home, the European heartland. It has never ventured this far afield before. And Afghanistan is vast, as large as Saskatchewan, twice the size of Germany, with a rugged geography that dwarfs military efforts of any size and that seems to mock military planning. Essentially, Afghanistan is a country with a huge mass of mountains smack in the middle, and around it is a flatter area.
It's really a geographical phenomenon that the fastest way to get around the country is in a circle, but the only main road in the country is the ring road.
Hugh Graham is a political writer who has made a special study of conflicts and geography in Afghanistan.
The war has been fought almost exclusively along that road and along the Taliban supply trails that cross the road or lead to the road.
So, understanding the fragile reality of this ring road is essential to grasping NATO's challenge. Largely skirting the central mountains, it holds the country together. If the Taliban can block this road, they can slice the country into parts.
NATO knows that the road is the lifeline to the country. The interesting thing is, they talk about the schools and wells and, you know, in impressive numbers, but they never talk about the road. They don't talk about the road, as far as I can tell, because the road is the Achilles heel of Afghanistan, and it's the Achilles heel of NATO, and they can't really hold it.
Why can't they hold it?
Because they don't have the numbers of troops.
Simple lack of numbers is a core NATO weakness. It's worth emphasizing this is actually a rather small counterinsurgency war over a massive area, in which neither side has enough fighters to fully achieve its objective. NATO commands the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, which has only 41,000 troops, the largest contingent of these American. A separate force of 7,000 U.S. troops under the banner Operation Enduring Freedom also operate there. As for the Afghan army, only about 20,000 of its soldiers are yet considered reliable. So there's only 68,000 to fight Taliban and Al-Qaeda, not half of what commanders would normally consider adequate. On the other hand, the Taliban fields only a very small guerrilla force, estimated between 15 to 20,000. They only seem larger because of their mobility. The weakness of NATO ensures the Taliban can create havoc with explosive devices and ambushes almost at will along the largely unguarded roads. This year, the number of Taliban attacks have quadrupled, over 600 roadside bombings. International relief supplies are so routinely ambushed and looted, relief officials warn of a humanitarian crisis this winter because of failing security.
We know from our own experience, the places where we have historically worked, we are having to be a lot more careful than we were in the past.
Kevin McCourt heads CARE Canada, which has been active on the ground in Afghanistan for 3 decades.
So there really is a substantial amount of the country, maybe up to a quarter of the country, that is in this in-between context of maybe having government control during the day, but say Taliban control at night. We should be expanding our programs in Afghanistan, and we find that, in fact, at the moment we're actually starting to contract in some key areas.
Bearing 1400, distance 3.5.
British members of the alliance have been the most vocal in warning that NATO is desperately under strength. Even when troops win ground, they lack the means to hold on to gains.
If there's a single fundamental weakness about what's going on in Afghanistan, it is the failure to follow up the military successes that there have been this year.
In London, Michael Clark is one of the most sought-after defense experts. He believes NATO is so weak, it has seen years of effort wasted.
In 2007, we have got back to the situation we were in 2002. So we are back to square one. We've got yet to get to square 10, and for that we need more resources and more time.
At the top, NATO politicians downplay military complaints to avoid stoking pessimism. But some top officers have openly complained of inadequate forces.
And I think the fact that some of them have gone so public, certainly in the United Kingdom, about it, is partly a symptom of the frustration they feel that the mission is not properly specified and, in a way, at NATO level, is not really properly resourced.
The problem is NATO badly miscalculated from the start, believing the Taliban were thoroughly beaten for good back in 2002. So many European nations sent in weak units utterly unprepared in training or mentality for a combat role. When the Taliban re-emerged in southern Afghanistan 2 years ago, few wanted anything to do with confronting them and have stayed well away from the south, refusing help to Canadians, Dutch, British and Americans who bear the brunt of the fighting. So NATO is not only under strength, it's also increasingly divided between those fighting and others who essentially stand aside. Historically, military alliances have been the most difficult forces to command, and counterinsurgency the most frustrating form of warfare. Certainly, both challenges are magnified in Afghanistan by almost satirical complexity.
The ISAF command structure is almost certainly the most complicated command structure NATO has ever tried to evolve, and it's the most complicated structure that's ever tried to conduct combat operations like this.
During night engagements, some NATO air units simply refuse to fly. German surveillance planes have not passed on real-time intelligence to allies in the south because that might put them in an active combat role. Each nationality mainly sticks to its own sector, often refusing help to others because of so-called caveats which limit any risk. Some seem unwilling to fight under any conditions.
Remember, there are, 37 nations serving in ISAF, the NATO nations plus about 10 non-NATO nations. There are a total of over 72 national caveats being operated, where nations will not allow their forces to do this or not do that, or only be used in strict self-defense, whatever it might be.
Most infuriating for hard-pressed Canadian troops is the fact repeated requests for helicopters from European allies have been rejected on grounds the whole of Europe has none to spare.
There are countries in the north and west of the country that do have helicopters but are not willing to commit those helicopters because they come with pilots, right? So the pilots would be under a threat of risking lives, and so those countries have not committed those helicopters. The Canadian aircraft.
Eleanor Sloan, professor of international affairs in Ottawa, notes NATO has even been reduced to trying to hire private helicopters flown by civilian contractors.
Quite remarkable, actually, as a final step that countries did not step up at the Defense Ministerial in October and say, yes, we'll commit our helicopters, and that NATO had to take this extraordinary step and say, okay, if we can't get any military forces down there, we'll have to go to civilian contractors. So, yes, indeed, a very strange situation.
The sense of malaise, adrift in the Afghanistan mission is now causing alarm in the Bush administration. A recent report of the White House by the powerful U.S. National Security Council warned that despite some success, NATO progress is lagging. Intelligence notes the Taliban's ability to quickly recover from setbacks, while NATO has fallen behind goals for training Afghan military and police. Above all, the administration notes NATO, with 2 million members under arms, has failed to come up with even modest reinforcement.
The Secretary for Defense of the United States.
Inside NATO, pressure to come up with more troops has largely deflected. It's admitted NATO is 10% short of requirements, but there's no interest in a surge of troops similar to the U.S. effort in Iraq.
Our job is to provide the NATO forces our military advisors say we do need. Am I happy? Not completely, but we have seen a substantial increase in the forces on the ground of NATO over the past 4 or 5 months. So I see no reason for a surge. Let us deliver, let the Allies deliver what they promised.
Any promise that you can fit on a fortune cookie is going to do someone else harm.
The promises of NATO members are greeted with skepticism by defense analysts, such as Anthony Cordesman, a former NATO strategic planner. He finds European members still underestimate the sacrifices required to save Afghanistan.
One of the problems here is the history of most operations like this is one of reacting rather than preventing, of having too few resources to begin and allowing the situation to deteriorate. The international community never seems to get it right the first time. If it gets it right at all, it's on the second or third attempt.
NATO is caught in its own standoff. Nations like Germany, France, Spain, who keep clear of major fighting, are lined up against those bearing the brunt of war. With no NATO reinforcements in sight, no volunteers to change places, Canadian, British, and Dutch troops appear trapped in the south. The Dutch recently bowed to pressure to stay in the south. Every indication by Canada that it might stay beyond next year merely lessens the pressure on the stand-asides to do more.
Every time Canada talks about extending the commitment, they're sounding just like the British, who are saying now quite openly, we're going to be there for a long time. We've taken this task on. We've got to try to see it through. But the more we say that, which after all is only an honest statement of the fact, the more we undercut our bargaining position with our other NATO allies. But the bottom line in all of this is that it is astonishing and scandalous that we have to negotiate in this way with our fellow allies in NATO, with whom we stood shoulder to shoulder during the Cold War. And it shows what a different organisation NATO is, that these things now have to be negotiated as if they're part of some great international treaty, not an alliance in a family of nations.
Let's get in your troops, ready to fire onto the next building. Spread them out.
What worries NATO is that its member nations are trapped in Afghanistan until a new Afghan army can stand on its own. Commanders insist that will take a decade or more.
An army is what's required to help them keep their security. So that's a longer-term project. It's going to take, 10 years or so just to work through and build an army to whatever the final number is that Afghanistan will have, and make them professional and set them up so that they can continue as an army and meet their security demands here.
But will NATO really bear the burden for years more, when even now many of its members are unwilling to put up sufficient forces to guarantee even basic security, such as protecting that main road?
It's because that we don't want to pay for the scale of engagement necessary, and it's because we don't want to go in with overwhelming force that we can't hold the ring road.
Historically, Afghanistan is the great breaker of armies. Could it also break NATO? That's no longer idle speculation.
Will there be any credibility for NATO to carry out missions anywhere else in the world to stabilize areas that pose security risks and threats to the members? There won't be if Afghanistan ends up being a failed mission. And I think that that's perhaps what the Allies are starting to recognize.
NATO has overcome many tense divisions and challenges before Afghanistan. Optimists believe there's every chance it will again prove its worth and cohesion to the world. But that may now depend on its ability to get those who stand by to join in the uneven struggle to keep open a singular road in a very large land.